Well, morning, everybody. I'm Lorna Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Standards Commission. And as David said, I'm here with my colleague, Richard Wilson, who's the case manager. We actually also have a member of the Standards Commission has snuck in to observe. So when you're asking me questions at the end, just bear that in mind and go easy on me, because one of our members, Susie Vestry, is actually here as well. I think for those of you who who joined the seminar last Wednesday, we explained our role and remit of the Standards Commission in a bit more detail. I'll just give a brief, just for anyone who wasn't there. So the remit of the Standards Commission is really to promote high ethical standards and to provide guidance on the codes of conduct and advice and how to interpret the provisions. And that's the Model Code of Conduct for members of devolved public bodies, but also the Councillors' Code as well. We do also have the other function, which is to adjudicate on complaints that councillors and members of devolved public bodies have breached the code. But really, we see our main function as the promoting the code. You know, we don't want people to breach it. We don't want to be having to adjudicate on complaints. So having said that, we had a bit of a debate with the Improvement Service about who went first in terms of this seminar, because I feel that I'm kind of maybe doing the slightly more be careful message, and Emma's going to be doing the much more positive message. But hopefully I won't scare you too much, and we'll finish on a high note anyway with Emma. So yeah, with that in mind, I'll move on to when the code might apply. So the code could well apply when you're using social media. I'll come on to talk in a bit more detail about, what we would look at to determine whether the code applies. But I just wanted, before I started to do that, for you to have a look at those 4 potential scenarios that I've put up on this slide, and just maybe to have a think, maybe give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or put it in the chat about whether you think the code would apply in each of those scenarios. So the first one is when you've stated on your social media account that all the content you've posted on it is you've done so in a private capacity. You've not done so in your capacity as a councillor. So do you think the code could possibly apply even if you've done that? So I don't know whether people can just give me a quick thumbs up or thumbs down, or put something in the chat. We will come back to this because I'll talk about it in more detail. So the second one is when you are liking a post from somebody else's account, could the code apply? The third is if you were posting from an anonymous account, you've not mentioned that you're a councillor anywhere on it, could it apply? And then the last minute is when you are commenting on a matter that really is nothing to do with your council. It's much more about something that's happened at either Holyrood or Westminster. Right. So having had a quick think about that, the code actually applies when you're acting as a councillor. So I think that's the obvious one. That's when you're in a council meeting or whatever, when you've referred to yourself as a councillor, and or when you could objectively be considered to be acting as a councillor. And so in determining whether the code applies in respect of that third scenario, we would apply an objective test, and we would consider whether a member of the public with knowledge of the relevant facts would reasonably consider that you were acting as a councillor at the time of the events in question. And on social media, that would be at the time you were posting a comment or reposting or whatever it was you were doing. So one thing to bear in mind is that our guidance notes that due to the public nature of social and print media and your profile as a local authority member, I think the starting point that you might want to think about is whether members of the public might automatically assume that you're commenting in your role as an elected politician in anything that you post, publish or share online, including on social media. So I think a starting point should maybe be that you should think about not ever posting anything that you wouldn't want to represent you. And I don't know whether this is a good analogy or a bad analogy, but the way I sort of think about it is if you were, for example, a councillor from Glasgow and you were standing in the middle of George Square with a megaphone, is really social media any different to that? You'd probably be known as a councillor, and therefore essentially social media is the same. It's essentially standing in a square with a megaphone. The same with maybe if you're a councillor from Orkney and you're in a pub in Kirkwall and you're, talking really, really loudly about council matters, would members of the public think that the code applies to you, that you're acting as a councillor at the time? Possibly, and that's really the same as social media. Other factors to think about is if you're representing or speaking on behalf of your council or purporting to do so, then in all likelihood the code will apply. If you're using council IT equipment or it's linked to an email account supplied by your council, then potentially the code could well apply. If your conduct online could reasonably be regarded as bringing your position or the council into disrepute, then potentially it could apply. And the big one is if you're engaged in political activity or commenting on matters of public concern, whether they fall out with or within the scope of the council's functions, then it might well be reasonable for a member of the public in applying that objective test to consider that you are acting as a councillor at the time you're making that post. You should always think about whether you are readily identifiable as a councillor. Does your social media page contain a biography that refers to your councillor? Have you put your council email address in that biography? And again, if you're mentioning the council or its work or functions or the services it provides, then chances are people may well think that you're acting as a councillor and the code would apply. So you are encouraged to seek advice if you're unsure on that. So just going back quickly to those scenarios, I think hopefully you've appreciated that basically the code could apply in any of those scenarios. Even if you've stated that everything you're posting is in a private capacity, if your social media account is open to members of the public, then that may not make a difference. If it's open to the members of the public and you're talking about council matters, then I think it would be reasonable for members of the public to consider you're acting as a councillor at the time. When you're liking a post from another person's account, again, very potentially the code, could apply to you. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but I think liking a post is a really difficult one. I think it's very easy to kind of look at something and think, oh, I agree with it, and to retweet or repost it, whatever. And it's just bearing in mind that you might need to be careful to make sure that it doesn't contain anything offensive, or that the account that you're posting it from doesn't contain anything that you wouldn't necessarily want to be associated with. When posting from an anonymous account, yes, you could. Well, the code still could apply to you, particularly again if you're talking about council matters. It could be that it's fairly easy to identify you from what you've said. And again, if you're commenting on a political matter, whether it's something that's out with the council's remit and functions or not, you may well be perceived as acting in your capacity as a politician, and that is therefore as a local councillor. So the code could well apply. So when we come on to do the questions and answers at the end, I will obviously see, if anyone disagrees with that, let me know and we'll have a conversation about it. But having said all that about the code applying, the good news is you don't need to worry about it applying if you are in fact complying with the substantive provisions in the code. And so Richard and I will talk about the ones that we think are relevant. And the first one is perhaps the most obvious one, and it's you need to behave with courtesy and respect at all times when the code could apply. And that is not just to your colleagues and officers, but it could apply also to members of the public. That doesn't mean that you're prevented from expressing views and making political comment. You're just required to do so in a way that's compatible with the substantive provisions in the code, and that's the ones that are in sections 3 to 7 and Annex A. I don't know whether many of you have a good sort of awareness of Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, but that is your right to freedom of expression. So obviously you do have that right to freedom of expression, and that means that the Standards Commission as a regulator can only restrict that right to freedom of expression, and we would restrict that right by finding a breach of the code and imposing a sanction. We can only justify a restriction on your right to freedom of expression if it's necessary and proportionate. So what I'm trying to explain there is that your right to freedom of expression is not an absolute, it is a qualified right. And essentially, we can restrict that right by finding a breach of the code for various reasons. The main one is to ensure that the conduct of public life at the local government level, and that would include public debate, does not fall below a minimum level. And that's to ensure public confidence in the council or democracy itself isn't undermined. Another important one is we can restrict that right to protect the rights and reputations of others. And so that could include protecting members of the public or council officers from offensive and abusive verbal attacks. Another reason we can restrict it is to allow good administration and the council to be able to function effectively. So that could be, for example, by preventing you from disclosing confidential information that could disrupt the council's effective running of the council. And also just to ensure that the council or the office of the councillor isn't brought into disrepute. So when we look at Article 10, it is a balancing exercise, balancing your right with essentially the rights of others. We do have an advice note that has much more information about Article 10. It's a little bit legalistic, so we also have a summary one. They're both on the website. It's quite a tricky topic. It's something that, there's so many factors involved in it, but I'm more than happy to answer questions on that, at the end. So having said all that, I think a key thing, and I'm sure Emma will talk about this more, but a key thing to think about is maybe focusing on the issues and rather than any individual, and certainly not making comments about, an individual's personal characteristics or, their appearance or whatever. Again, we'll cover this in a bit more detail, but just bear in mind that there is not any requirement to respond to every comment posted, every message, even a direct message that you've received on social media. You should always consider whether you have to respond and whether it's appropriate or helpful to do so. I'm sure you're all aware as politicians that people do say nasty things and that they can single you out for abuse. So I think it's a case of, if someone criticising you is doing it in a respectful way and they just have the wrong information, then by all means you might want to engage with them. But if it's a case that they're being, really abusive, then I think you should really think about whether there is any value in engaging and essentially whether you could just make the situation worse. And there's no requirement. Again, I think we talked about this last week, but there's absolutely no requirement in the code for you to respond, even if it's a direct message, and you wouldn't be breaching the code by deciding just to ignore something. So another, I think there was a question there, but I'll look at those at the end. Sorry, I can't. It's tricky to do both at the same time. But another part of the code that you need to be aware about is that it requires you to refrain from undermining any individual council officer or identifiable group of officers, or from raising concerns about the performance, conduct, or capability in public. So that would obviously include the public, would obviously include when you're on social media, and you shouldn't use social media to encourage anyone else to do so. So, you shouldn't be posting something that, is going to encourage other people to criticise individual officers. The code obviously says that you should refrain from bullying and harassment, and that applies equally online as it would when you're in person or in any other means of communication. So again, we've produced an advice note for councillors on bullying and harassment. It notes that harassment is any unwelcome behaviour or conduct that makes someone feel offended, humiliated, intimidated, frightened, or even uncomfortable in certain situations. Bullying is inappropriate and unwelcome behaviour, which is offensive and intimidating, and it usually arises from an individual misusing their position of strength over someone else. And just bear in mind on that I think you would usually be considered to be in a position of strength over council officers, given, especially when you're on social media, given that they don't have the right to reply, and also it's, you're likely to have a public following. And it's important to note that even if the behaviour is unintentional, it could still be classed as a form of bullying or harassment. I think I'm going to pass over to you, Richard, now. Are you okay to take control of the slides?
Yep, thanks. Okay, so morning, everyone. I'm going to now talk a little bit about confidentiality. So the code itself states that you're not allowed to disclose confidential information or information which reasonably should be regarded of being of a confidential or a private nature. And that's without the express consent of the person or body that's authorised to give consent. And if you can't obtain such express consent, then you should assume that it's not given. And the code makes it clear that confidential information is not just information that's deemed to be confidential by statute. Information that's confidential can also include discussions, documents, and information which is not yet public or which is never intended to be public. Paragraph 3.23 of the code states that you're only to use confidential information to undertake your duties as a councillor, and you shouldn't use it in any way for personal or party political advantage or to discredit the council. And that's even if you're of the view that the information should be publicly available. Sometimes confidentiality is a matter of timing, and that the information may eventually be released into the public domain at a later stage. However, you should respect the requirement for confidentiality, even if you yourself consider that the information should be released earlier. As always, if you're in any doubt, you should seek advice as to whether any documents, information, or other items are confidential, and that's particularly if you're intending to disclose their contents to any outside body or individual. We've had a few cases on confidentiality in the social media realm. We'll just talk quickly about a couple of examples. In this first example, at a hearing held by the Standards Commission, a councillor was found to have disclosed on his Facebook account sensitive information about the council's response to the COVID pandemic. And this was despite the information in question having been provided by officers to elected members at private briefings, and despite it having been made clear that all information provided at those briefings was to remain confidential until officers had time to prepare the council's public communications on the matter. Now, in that case, the hearing panel noted that confidentiality, as I've said, is sometimes a matter of timing, and the information may eventually be released into the public domain. And in this case, the panel noted that the councillor may have been trying to be open, trying to be transparent, so that his constituents were informed about decisions that had been made and were to be made, but it didn't consider that he was entitled to disclose the information when he did. The panel noted that by disclosing the information in question, the councillor was likely to have encouraged interest and questions, some of which would probably have gone towards council officers. That would have resulted in officers having to take time to respond, as opposed to being able to impart the information proactively. And Lorna mentioned earlier the right to freedom of expression. And in this case, the panel found that a restriction on the councillor's right to freedom of expression could be justified, and that was because of the need to preserve confidentiality until the council's final decision was made and council officers were able to perform their duties and avoid any undue or unnecessary concern amongst the public. A second example is one where a councillor was found to have breached the code by disclosing confidential information, again in a Facebook post, that derived from internal council briefing documents about the proposed closure of some council leisure facilities. Now, the details of the proposed closures were of a confidential nature, and the panel in that case found that the councillor should have been aware that the information regarding the future of the facilities was not to be disclosed, given the reminders that had been issued to him about the confidentiality. The panel didn't consider that the previous sharing of the information in question among members of the councillor's political group and wider political party membership removed the requirement for confidentiality of those documents to be maintained until the council itself was ready to release them. A few other aspects of the code to consider in relation to social media. If you're using your council issued equipment when you're accessing or posting on social media platforms, then you need to comply with any of your council's social media, general media, IT or communications policies. The code also states that you can't use council resources imprudently, so that's without thinking about the implications or consequences. You can't use them unlawfully. You can't use them for any party political or campaigning activities, and you can't use them improperly. You should also be mindful of Section 7 of the Code, which deals with quasi-judicial or regulatory applications, and ensure that you're not posting anything on social media that is or could perceive to be demonstrative of bias, unfairness, or you prejudging in respect of any outstanding quasi-judicial applications. So that's things like licensing and planning, as I'm sure you know. You should avoid on social media making any public comments that could bring your council into disrepute. And just note paragraphs 24 and 25 of Annex A. I've got a little excerpt from Annex A there on the screen. That doesn't seek to restrict your ability to properly scrutinise the performance of the council or the council employees, but instead it seeks to discourage you from making unfounded public accusations, and that's either about any council employee or the council itself as an entity. A few other factors to consider. Firstly, I think you need to always bear in mind the immediate and permanent nature of any comment or post that you're about to make. You'll often have no control over the extent to which your posts are shared and who is going to be sharing them. Consider whether you might make that comment in person, as Lorna said earlier, face to face. Do you have such conviction in what you're about to share that you would be prepared to justify it if you were challenged at a later date? And you should also carefully consider the privacy settings of your account, and bear in mind that anyone who's able to view your social media content will be able to screenshot it and publicly share it if they choose to do so. Again, think about liking, reposting, retweeting comments or posts. Could you be reasonably regarded as endorsing the original opinion, comment, or information that you're sharing, including other information on the site that you may not have shared but can easily be linked to? Have you read fully and understood properly any comment or content that you're commenting on, liking, or reposting? And also, quite importantly, tone is very hard to discern and convey online. So consideration should be given whether any humour, irony, or sarcasm might be perceived as such, or whether anything you might be posting could be interpreted otherwise. You should also think about whether your comments are likely to bring your office as a councillor or your council itself into disrepute, whether when you're posting that you're treating others with courtesy, respect, and consideration, and whether making the point that you're making in a more respectful and constructive manner might have more of an impact in terms of actually influencing people online. Thinking about your own social media pages, you might consider whether you want to have comments switched on and allow disagreement on your social media pages. Also, Lorna said this earlier, whether you have to respond or if it's appropriate or helpful to do so. And also the stricter rules around election publicity in the pre-election period. So I'll now hand back to Lorna.
Yeah, so I've put this slide up, complaint avoidance. So I don't want you to think that these examples that I've given would necessarily be a breach of the code. That's not why I put them up. The reason I put them up is just because anybody can make a complaint to the Ethical Standards Commissioner about a breach of the code. Obviously, complaints are made all the time that are, without merit or vexatious, or someone just doesn't really understand the code's requirements. But if a complaint is made about you, even if it's not going to be investigated, even if it's the Ethical Standards Commissioner decides that it's completely meritless and shouldn't be investigated, it can still be stressful. If a complaint is investigated, even if it's not ultimately upheld, it can be time consuming for you to have to respond. Like I said, it can be stressful. So, I'm not trying to discourage anyone from using social media, but just bear that in mind, especially I think I put up here satire. A complaint was made to the Ethical Standards Commissioner. It wasn't upheld, but it was about, you know, a councillor made a joking kind of comment about reaction to the UK's Eurovision entry. You know, you would think fairly sort of harmless and innocuous, whatever, but a complaint was made about that. And obviously that councillor then had to respond. Images and memes, again, you know, that's the kind of thing that the Ethical Standards Commissioner gets complaints about. You know, I've put up there the example again of reposting a doctored image of someone in a demeaning position. That one was actually investigated. Sharing or liking a post, it was, I think I'm not sure it was deliberate. I'm not sure the person who shared it really understood that the post that they were sharing did actually contain, it linked to an article that contained anti-Semitic comments that I'm sure that the person who reposted wouldn't have wanted to be associated with. So it's just I think what the slide I probably should have called it just be careful. I didn't say at the start that I maybe should have said, but I think another good rule of thumb is perhaps don't ever use social media if you've had a glass of wine or a beer. It's quite tempting, but I think that's something to just bear in mind as well. Sorry, I'm conscious that we're taking up some of your time now, so I will finish up, I promise. So just to remind everybody that we've got guidance on the code, and we've got various advice notes on various topics there, including the use of social media, assisting constituents, bullying and harassment. They're all on the website, along with decisions that we've made at hearings, along with decisions that we've made to take no action as well on cases that are referred to us. The codes are on the website as well, and our quarterly standards updates. And just a reminder, if you're ever unsure about the code and you want to have a conversation and just check your understanding, please don't hesitate to get in contact with Richard or me at any time. Okay, I'll pass you on to Emma now.
Thank you very much. As Lorna sort of suggested, they were the bad cops, and I'm going to be the good cop now, in a sense. Yeah, my name's Emma Swift. I'm a communications officer at the Improvement Service. But prior to that, I did work for a member of the Scottish Parliament and managed his social media presence. So I kind of have experience of adhering to the code, as well as kind of, you know, trying to sort of work within it to make sure that you can still send out the content that you want, while making sure that you're responding, you're dealing with working within the code and behaving appropriately on social media. So I very much see social media as a force for good. I tell my colleagues at the Improvement Service this all the time, but particularly for councillors, public figures like yourself, it enables you to reach a vast number of people that you would never be able to contemplate reaching by knocking on doors or putting out leaflets. People very rarely kind of attend council meetings, but your comment or your report or a little video clip about what happened in council that day, that can reach hundreds or even thousands of people. It also enables you to monitor kind of online conversations about what's happening in your community. So sort of you can get intelligence on what the issues are almost before sometimes they emerge. If you've got people on a local Facebook group who are complaining about a junction or a pothole, you can kind of respond to that before it even becomes an issue that the council might be aware of. So it's a really useful tool in that sense as well. I always think of it as a two-way conversation when it comes to councillors and public figures, that you can absolutely use social media to get information yourself, as well as using it as a way to communicate information. I'm just going to run through a little bit about the different social media platforms and their sort of benefits and disadvantages. Facebook still, despite all the new kids on the block, still has the widest reach across the UK population, and is probably going to be the main platform that residents will use to find out local information. So it's probably the one you're most likely to want to be on. X, or Twitter, as even I still call it as a comms person, it's no longer used as widely by the public. the sort of the number of your ordinary people on X is kind of dropping, but it is still a useful platform to reach kind of organisations, especially charities, third sector within your local area, other political figures and journalists as well. Journalists monitor Twitter quite closely, and it's also good to use as a way to find out what's happening in your area because it's so immediate. Facebook isn't as immediate as X, so that's kind of good that you can really get that sort of breaking news about an issue that might be happening in your area from that channel. Instagram is owned by the same company as Facebook. It's more, I would say, more for younger people, but it's kind of increasingly sort of becoming a sort of a partner to Facebook in terms of the numbers and the kind of the reach that you're going to get. But it is a very visual channel, so you need to be confident in creating photo and video content, and you need to be, you know, careful a little bit if you're doing filming sort of video or live video, especially thinking about what you're saying, because you've not got that practice run that you might have with typing some content. So that is something to bear in mind if you're going to have a try at that. So TikTok, probably not a priority for elected members, but political parties, some councils are starting to use it. So it might be something that you join just to monitor, again, what's happening so that you can keep an eye on certain themes or issues or hashtags and just sort of see what's happening in your local area. Nextdoor is a smaller social media platform, which you may already be aware of, but some people don't know about it. It's a very locality focused social media platform. So it's based on your postcode, and it allows you to speak directly to those who only those people who live in your community. Like I said, it's not as widely used, but it's definitely a good one if you want to find out what people are complaining about in your area. I'm a member of the Nextdoor in my local community, and it's full of people complaining about, you know, this tree needs cutting down, this path needs clearing. So it's a great one for kind of keeping an eye on what's going on locally. So personal or professional, Lorna kind of alluded to this a little bit about if you are known to be a councillor, it is very difficult for you ever to make a personal post or a private post. It's just not going to work. So you really do need to keep your personal and professional life separate when it comes to social media. Facebook, you might want to consider creating a Facebook page rather than an individual profile. It provides you with a few extra sort of security protections and privacy protections. Other platforms also have options for creating public accounts, so it's more about you as a public figure rather than you as an individual. So it's very clear you're communicating as a councillor. There can be no sort of miscommunication on that one. And as Lorna said, you are ultimately responsible for what you post on social media, whether you think you're doing it in a personal or a professional capacity. What I would add is if you do have what you consider to be personal profiles, or even if you're doing this on a professional one, you should be very careful about what you share, especially anything which could identify personal details about yourself, like your address or phone number or information about your family. Obviously, you know, online abuse is fairly common, unfortunately. Offline abuse, thankfully less, but there obviously are cases of it happening, and you want to be mindful of that security aspect all the time. So that's why it's very important to sort of have that personal and professional. And I know quite a lot of politicians, when they first become elected, actually kind of shut down their personal profiles completely because they don't want that to sort of muddy the waters or for there to be any kind of issues around them sharing personal information. So social media etiquette, some of this we've kind of touched on a little bit. Be polite and respectful. I mean, it's common sense, but it's sometimes difficult to do in the heat of the moment. Disagreement is to be expected in politics. I mean, as we're saying, we're not expecting that you're going to post, very bland statements that nobody's going to disagree with. That's not what we want. There's freedom of expression. You should be able to make comment on things that are happening. But imagine, as Lorna said, that you're speaking to this person face to face when you write any post. So, is it something you would physically say to someone if they were there in the room with you? And if it's not, the chances are you shouldn't be posting it on social media. So keep it short and simple. X, Twitter, forces you to be brief, but that doesn't mean that you should just write big, long screeds of text on Facebook or other platforms. People are very short attention spans these days. So if you want to get a message out to people, you need to do it in the first few lines and sort of keep it as brief as possible so that you can attract their attention, get the information you want to get to them before they move on to the next post. You want to make sure that the information you're sharing is accurate and it's not confidential, as Richard has sort of mentioned. Once it's out there, you do lose control over what happens to it next. So that's another thing to bear in mind. Are you happy for that other people might be sharing it or passing it on to friends or screenshotting it? That's another thing to sort of bear in mind. Am I happy that this is that could be seen by a much wider audience than I might expect? Social media is all about sort of having conversations, I think. So you should be responsive. But as Lorna said, there is not a requirement to do so if someone is being abusive or asking the same question over and over and over again. When I worked for an MSP, we had a sort of a simple rule. If somebody asked what we thought was a reasonable and polite question, we would always respond to them. If we felt they were just having a barb, having a go, posting something because they were annoyed, then we would let them simmer and see if they came back to us perhaps with an actual question or a request for help that we could engage with them on, rather than simply sort of adding fuel to the fire by commenting on their own angry comments, even if it was to try and explain or calm things down. I think the next one is one of the most important things is apologise if you get things wrong. If you do post something that's got a little mistake in it, or it's, maybe you missed a decimal point in a number or something, just accept responsibility, apologise for the confusion. It immediately takes the power out of any potential negative consequences. I know a lot of people think if there's a tweet that's got a mistake in it, they just delete it and post a new one, but they never disappear, trust me. So it's best, I find, to just quote tweet or quote post the original with the mistake, with the correction and the apology. And that just immediately calms the situation. Perhaps another really important thing is not to give political opponents an opportunity to respond aggressively to your posted content. So tone, as Richard was talking about, is very important. If you post highly critical, highly inflammatory comments, the chances are you're going to get that back. So it's about how you communicate and the tone of voice that you use when you do so. You can still disagree, and you can still disagree strongly with something, but it's the tone in which you write that content and what you post that will shape the kind of responses you get. And I think it goes without saying, don't get involved in online arguments. You're not going to win. All you're going to do is waste a lot of your time and energy, stress yourself out. And you're never going to change their minds if they're that diametrically opposed to what you believe in. So save your energy for positive communication is my top tip. Setting your own rules is very important. So set rules about how you'll engage on social media. That will manage the expectations of your constituents and set out how you expect them to behave. So it's things like even something as simple as saying this account is monitored from 9 to 5, so that people posting on an evening know that they might not get an immediate response from you, or something along those lines. COSLA have worked with the Local Government Association in England and Wales to come up with these rules of engagement. as David said, we will be sharing these slides, so you can click on these links and have a look at these suggestions that they've come up with for what you might want to put. You could put this content in your about section on Facebook so that people could look at that and see what they can expect from you, and also how they should behave. Social media mental health, which is hugely important and something that's talked about a lot as a, social media is a force for good. I do believe that, but there are unfortunately some unpleasant sides to it, and you do need to take care of yourself if you're going to use it. So don't hesitate to hide or delete abusive posts or to block those people who make them. Hide and delete is a very useful tool, I find, because it's the only people that can see it after you've hidden or deleted a post are people who follow the original poster. So it won't appear on your page, but the original poster will be able to see it, and so will the few people that follow them. It's kind of like the first step, I would say, if you've got someone who's constantly making unpleasant comments, is take that step first, because they don't get notified about that, so they're unlikely to then sort of respond further. If they're blocked, they will know that they've been blocked, and you might find that actually that can add fuel to the fire. What I would say is take screenshots of if there are sort of really abusive or unpleasant posts, take screenshots of them so that you can keep a record of the behaviour. And persistent offenders, report to the platform itself. That's not just for your protection, but for others. If someone's posting abusive or unpleasant comments on your Twitter or Facebook platform, the chances are they're doing it to other people as well. And taking a break from social media, or even just from specific platforms, can be good for your mental health, especially if you've had, perhaps been involved in a very controversial decision and you've had a lot of contact. Just make sure you're informing your followers on social media so that they know to contact you by other methods. But you can, take a couple of weeks off, just put a pinned post to the top of your thread so that they can see, I'm going to be off this platform for a couple of weeks, but you can still contact me via email or however. COSLA and the LGA have also created a guide to help you deal with trolls and online abuse, so that you can hopefully manage it without the person being so upset that they make a report to the Standards Commission, but also to take care of yourself. That's kind of the most important thing, really, when you're in this situation. And fake news, which is obviously a big and huge phrase at the moment, sort of buzzword, but it goes back to that responsibility for anything that you post or share on your media or social media channels, including information which may later turn out to be incorrect, which unfortunately with AI and deep fakes and things is happening more and more often. So check the accuracy of the content before you post or share it. And as I said before, with mistakes, correct anything you've shared which has turned out to be inaccurate. It's a little bit about just doing due diligence, I guess. If you see something that you think is interesting or that people in your area might find informative, just check the source. And it's a little bit like liking posts from someone that then turns out to have posted other content which you wouldn't want to be associated with. It's just about doing that due diligence before you share anything, to make sure that there's not going to be any unintended consequences from what you post or like or share. So some additional resources here. We worked with the National Communications Group Scotland and a comms expert called Dan Slee to create Follow Me Too, which is a social media guide for elected members. Dan also hosted a webinar, and you can watch a recording on the website. The Local Government Association has a number of different social media resources and guides, including the ones that I just showed you. Although they are aimed at elected members in England and Wales, so you might find some things where it's not quite relevant, many of the principles remain the same. So you can look at those and you'll find that the principles are still as helpful. Just be aware that they are aimed at elected members in England and Wales, so take that into consideration when you're taking a look at them. But all these links will be in the slides that we send out, so you can have a look at those at your leisure. And that is me finished. So back to you, David.